Welcome to a Sherlock Holmes mystery. A glittering Christmas gala, a vanished treasure, and footprints that don't belong. A noble family shaken, a safe no one could open yet someone did. A charming captain, a secret affair, and a velvet pouch full of lies. But beneath the frost and fog, something far more dangerous stirs. Holmes thinks it's over, but the game is only just beginning. Before we unravel it all, tell us, where are you listening from tonight? It was a bitterly cold December morning when I first heard of the affair that would later be known as the Christmas Heist. The fog had rolled in from the Thames, thick and yellow as old parchment, muffling the clatter of carriage wheels along Baker Street. Holmes sat in his chair by the fire, long fingers steepled beneath his chin, his hawk-like profile illuminated by the faint glow of embers. I, for my part, had been busy perusing the day's Times when a sharp rap on the door startled us both from our reveries. Mrs. Hudson ushered in a tall man with a look of nervous agitation, his overcoat dusted with frost and his gloved hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Reginald Farnsworth, sir," she announced. The name struck a faint chord in my memory, an industrial magnate of considerable reputation, if I was not mistaken. "Mr. Holmes," the gentleman began, his voice betraying a mixture of anxiety and indignation. "I have come to you because Scotland Yard is, if you'll pardon the phrase, completely at sea. A robbery has occurred at my home in Grosvenor Square. Not just any robbery, mind you, but one committed under circumstances that defy reason." Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Pray, sit down, Mr. Farnsworth. Begin at the beginning, and spare no detail, however trifling it may appear." The man sank into the armchair, removed his gloves with a distracted air, and continued. "Last night, my wife and I hosted our annual Christmas Eve charity gala. The house was filled with guests, aristocrats, politicians, even a bishop. Everything went splendidly until this morning, when the safe in my private study was found open. The Farnsworth diamonds, heirlooms worth nearly £30,000, had vanished." "Was the safe forced?" asked Holmes. "No, that's the most confounding part of it. The lock is of the latest design, Smithson and Hardy, double mechanism, combination, and key. There is no sign of tampering. The key never leaves my possession, and the combination is known only to myself and my wife." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "You say the house was crowded. Were there servants or guests who might have had access to the study?" "The servants, yes, but they were under supervision throughout the evening. As for the guests, no one had any reason to enter that room. And yet," he paused, leaning forward, "when I examined the carpet this morning, there were footprints in the ash near the hearth, only one set, small, narrow, and unmistakably belonging to a woman." Holmes rose and began to pace, his eyes distant. A woman's footprints, a secure, safe, and a theft executed without force or sound. Intriguing. "And the jewels, were they insured?" "Yes, by Lloyd's, but I would gladly forfeit every penny to know how this infernal thing was done. The police have already questioned Lady Farnsworth, my wife, and several of the guests, but they're convinced it must have been one of the servants. I know better." Holmes's tone grew thoughtful. "A locked room theft, with no signs of entry, and a single feminine trace. It bears, I think, the stamp of deliberate misdirection." Farnsworth frowned. "You mean it was staged?" "Perhaps. Or perhaps the thief is cleverer than those who suspect her. Either way, I must see the scene myself." He turned to me abruptly. "Watson, my hat and coat. We shall go to Grosvenor Square immediately. There's mischief under that roof, and it will not do to let Christmas morning pass without examining the ashes while they are still warm." As we stepped out into the fog-drenched street, I could not help but feel the electric thrill that always accompanied Holmes at the outset of a new case. The bells of street. Mary's tolled in the distance, muffled by the mist, as our hansom clattered away from Baker Street toward the house where, amid the glitter of Christmas finery, a perfect crime had been committed. Our cab drew up before the stuccoed mansion, its windows wreathed in holly and red ribbon. A footman with the solemnity of disaster showed us by a corridor of portraits to a walnut door. "My study," said Farnsworth, unlocking it with a key from his chain. Holmes stood aside to let him enter, then slipped within as noiselessly as a cat. It was a sober, comfortable room, bookcases in mahogany, a turkey carpet, a writing desk strewn with invitations, and against the far wall, a Smithson and Hardy safe with twin enamel dials. The hearth held a low bed of grey ash. Holmes went to one knee before it. "You were right about the prince," he murmured. "Small, high-arched. The heel is sharply chamfered, a fashionable boot, but worn at the outer edge." He traced the track where the ash thinned. "Note, too, the faint ridge of colder ash where a gust passed across the grate." Someone opened a window. Farnsworth looked incredulous. "The casement is latched and barred. It overlooks the mews 20 feet to cobbles." Nonetheless, it was lifted. Holmes returned, glancing at the brass. A semicircle of rubbed metal, precisely where a gloved thumb would press. And inside the pane, a tide mark where breath condensed, though the fire still burned. A signal, perhaps, or merely air for heated nerves. He crossed to the safe. Fresh oil on the keyway, dropped clumsily, the ring in the dust betrays it. "Your servants are forbidden to touch this piece." "They are," said our client firmly. "Only my wife and I approach at it, and you alone hold the key at night. Under my pillow." Holmes neither contradicted nor assented. He skimmed a finger over a hinge cap and showed us a minute crescent of black upon his nail. Lampblack mixed with gum, useful for darkening a scratch or taking a fugitive impression. "Someone made experiments here." He stooped, sniffed, and smiled faintly. "Frankincense, from the ballroom, coal gas, and vermilion wax." With the poker, he stirred the ash and produced a brittle red fleck. A cracker pulled at this grate, or a seal reheated. Either would explain sooty fingers. "You believe the combination was learned?" I asked. "Attempted," he corrected. "Consider the order. A diversion in the ballroom. Corridor emptied. A trial at the safe. Failure at the first difficulty. And retreat by signal at the window. What hour did your merriment crest?" "11:30 the carolers sang in the square," said Farnsworth. "After midnight, there was a charade." Holmes moved to the mantel. A porcelain shepherdess had been shoved back. He plucked from beneath it a filament of metallic tinsel with a queer green luster. "Your decorations favor holly and crimson. This dye is of a continental novelty. Which guest lately returned from abroad?" Farnsworth named a Belgian attaché, a Saxon baroness, and a mezzo-soprano newly arrived for Covent Garden. "But it is unthinkable." "We shall leave thinking to facts," Holmes replied, mild as a scalpel. At the desk, he found a half-sheet whose top had been torn away. He breathed upon the blotter. Ghostly letters rose. "Carolers require shillings at 11:30. Send tray to side door." Admirably timed to empty a passage. He rang for the housekeeper, who entered with boot trays at Holmes's request. The inspection that followed was swift. At last he paused over a pair of finely kept ladies' ankle boots, small and high-arched, their tread harboring a glittering grit. He teased out the mote with a penknife. "Iron filings," he said. "To whom do these belong?" "To Miss Bligh," said Mrs. Price, stiffly. "Her ladyship's companion." "A companion acquainted with a workshop," Holmes mused. "She scarcely left the conservatory," Farnsworth protested. "She is nervous and avoids crowds." "Timidity is a serviceable mask. Where are your workshops kept?" "In the basement. I keep a small bench for my steel patents." Holmes's eyes took light. "Then we shall see both bench and ballroom. Mr. Farnsworth, oblige me by keeping every soul within call. It is Christmas Day, but thieves are poor churchmen. Come, Watson, There is more truth in the drafts between rooms than in the oaths of a dozen guests. And send no messages. I would observe their faces unprompted by warning this morning. We shall begin with the butler. The butler, a pale and tight-lipped man named Graves, stood rigid as Holmes regarded him with those grey, unblinking eyes that could read a conscience like a ledger. "You have been with Mr. Farnsworth how long?" Holmes asked quietly. 13 years, sir. Since before his marriage. Then you know the habits of the household well. Who fetched the tray for the carolers last night? I did, sir. I took it myself to the side door. Holmes nodded as though that satisfied some private calculation. And who directed you to do so? Miss Bligh, sir. Her ladyship's companion. She said Mr. Farnsworth wished it. Holmes turned slightly toward me, his profile sharp against the glow of the study fire. Just so. Observe the relay. Watson, an instruction purporting to come from the master, delivered by one who never acts save at her mistress's bidding. Yet the mistress gave no such order, and the servant obeyed without question. The interval thus contrived would leave the corridor to the study unguarded for at least 5 minutes. Farnsworth's face had gone grim. Are you implying? I imply nothing, Holmes interrupted coolly. I collect facts. We descended to the basement, Graves leading the way through a warren of stone passages until the smell of oil and metal greeted us. A small workbench stood beneath a gas jet. The surface cluttered with fine tools, vices, and curls of steel. Holmes stooped to pick up a scrap of dark cloth, a fragment from a skirt hem. He murmured, coated with the same iron filings I found upon Miss Bligh's boots. The coincidence grows instructive. He examined the bench more closely, testing the jaws of the vise and fingering a tiny impression left in the grease. A key blank, he said softly, and here the smudge of vermilion wax from the study hearth. Our unknown visitor practiced here, but not alone. We returned upstairs to the conservatory, a long glass chamber fragrant with winter roses. There stood Miss Bligh, a slight woman in a dove-grey gown, her pale hair drawn back with exacting neatness. Her eyes, large and anxious, lifted at our approach. Mr. Holmes, she said tremulously, Mr. Farnsworth tells me you wish to speak with me. I assure you I know nothing whatever of this dreadful affair. Holmes bowed. I am certain you would not willingly involve yourself in dishonor. Yet truth often hides behind fear, and fear behind kindness. Perhaps you can tell me, Miss Bligh, why you carried a candle to the study shortly after 11. Her lips parted in astonishment. How could you know? The mark of tallow upon the window ledge, my dear lady. Its scent lingers still, mixed with your perfume of violet water. She clasped her hands together. I went only to fetch a music folio Lady Farnsworth left there. I saw nothing. Indeed? Not even a figure by the safe? Her breath caught audibly. Holmes's tone grew almost gentle. Someone entered the room within moments of your visit. The footprints tell me so. Were you alone when you returned to the ballroom? She hesitated, then whispered. Lady Farnsworth joined me near the corridor. She said she had gone to her dressing room. Holmes turned to our host. Sir, permit me a private word with your wife. You may rely upon my discretion. Lady Farnsworth entered, moments later. Tall, elegant, her face calm, yet faintly defiant. Holmes regarded her as though measuring an equation. Your ladyship, he said, your companion shows remarkable loyalty. You would spare her humiliation, yet the burden is not hers. She drew herself up. I do not understand you. Then let me be plain. The safe was opened not by theft but by substitution. The key beneath your husband's pillow was exchanged during the night. The copy made in your basement vice. Miss Bligh procured the interval, but the design was yours, or rather, not wholly yours. You were persuaded by another. For a heartbeat she wavered, then sank into a chair, her composure dissolving. He said it was only to borrow them to sell and redeem them before the insurance expired. My husband's ventures have failed. He feared ruin. Holmes's voice hardened. And this, he who? Captain Allardyce, she murmured, an old friend. Holmes's eyes flashed with the keen light of the chase. Then the next act of our drama lies with the gallant captain. Watson, fetch your revolver. I fancy our Christmas morning is not yet over. The hansom wheels hissed through the slush as we sped from Grosvenor Square toward Pall Mall, where Captain Allardyce was said to lodge at his club. Holmes sat opposite me, his face drawn into that sphinx-like stillness I had come to recognize as the prelude to action. The fog had thickened into a damp yellow veil, and the lamps burned dimly, casting halos over the pavement. When I ventured to speak, Holmes lifted a finger. "Not yet, Watson. The pattern is forming, but one thread remains hidden." If Lady Farnsworth spoke truthfully, the captain is no common rogue, but a man of social standing. That makes his folly either desperate or exceedingly cunning. At the club, we found the hall porter polishing silver buttons and looking none too eager to admit callers at such an hour. Holmes presented his card with quiet authority. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, on urgent business for Captain Allardyce." The name carried weight. Within moments we were shown up to a private room overlooking the street. Allardyce stood by the hearth, a striking figure in a velvet smoking jacket, his moustache carefully waxed and his manner languid. Yet behind his poise I caught a flicker of unease. "Holmes, the famous detective. To what do I owe this intrusion before breakfast?" Holmes bowed slightly. "To a matter of misplaced property, Captain. Specifically, £30,000 in diamonds belonging to your friend Mr. Farnsworth." The captain's expression hardened, but he recovered swiftly, affecting a laugh. "Good heavens, you don't suggest I'm mixed up in that farce? The papers will have a field day." Holmes moved nearer, his voice silk over steel. "Farce? Yes, one of your own composition perhaps. You convinced Lady Farnsworth that temporary possession would solve her husband's financial distress, knowing full well that your gaming debts in Monte Carlo had come due. The clever trick of insurance fraud, dressed in chivalry." Allardyce's eyes narrowed. "You go too far, sir." Holmes ignored the protest. "The diamonds left Grosvenor Square last night. They could not have been pawned openly, too conspicuous, too soon. You would need a quiet fence, and one who deals in high-value jewels without question. In London there are precisely two such men. One keeps to Hatton Garden, the other operates under the guise of an antique dealer in Bloomsbury. I visited both this morning before coming here." The captain's composure faltered. What did they say?" Holmes's smile was slight, almost cruel. "That a gentleman answering your description called at 8:30, seeking to sell unset stones for a lady's discretion. When told the dealer would require 24 hours to verify authenticity, he left in haste. The description was exact, down to your silver-headed cane." Allardyce took a step backward, one hand unconsciously clutching his breast pocket. "This is preposterous. You have no proof." Holmes's tone turned crisp. "On the contrary, proof is the simplest part. When I entered your club, I observed a faint smear of vermilion wax upon your cuff, a residue identical to that found in Mr. Farnsworth's study. Shall I assume you were sealing Christmas cards at 3 in the morning?" The captain's bravado drained away. He reached for the decanter with trembling fingers. "You've no right." "I have every right," Holmes interrupted. "The diamonds are on your person. You meant to sail from Dover today, posing as a courier for Her Majesty's consulate. I telegraphed the station master an hour ago to delay the 9 o'clock departure. I imagine your luggage has already been inspected." There was a long silence. Then Allardyce gave a bitter laugh. "You've trapped me neatly, Mr. Holmes. I suppose I must admire the artistry." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small velvet pouch, tossing it onto the table. "There's your treasure. Take it, and give my compliments to Scotland Yard." Holmes made no move to touch it. "You mistake me, Captain. I have no interest in trophies. My concern is justice and the preservation of a woman's reputation." You will come quietly. Without scandal, Inspector Lestrade awaits downstairs. As Lestrade's men led the disgraced officer away, Holmes turned to the window, the faintest sigh escaping him. How many minds, Watson, waste their cleverness upon deceit rather than its unmasking? It is the eternal paradox of our profession. When we returned to Baker Street that afternoon, the fog had lifted, revealing a pale winter sun. Holmes seated himself by the fire once more, striking a match for his pipe. "I fear," he murmured, "that even at Christmas, human frailty proves the most inexhaustible of mysteries. The affair might have concluded then and there, had it not been for one stubborn inconsistency that refused to rest easy in Holmes's mind. That evening, as twilight deepened over Baker Street and the first flakes of snow began to fall, he sat silent in his chair, the diamond pouch lying unopened on the mantel. I had congratulated him on the swiftness of his success, yet he gave no sign of satisfaction. The smoke from his pipe curled upward like the ghosts of unspoken doubts. At last he spoke. "Watson, have you ever noticed how triumph often conceals unease? There is a note missing in this symphony, a small discord that offends the ear. I cannot persuade myself that Captain Allardyce was the sole composer of our little Christmas fugue." I frowned. "But surely, his confession, his possession of the jewels—" "Precisely," Holmes interjected, "too ready, too pat. A man of his vanity does not capitulate without bargaining for dignity." There was relief, not despair, in his tone when Lestrade took him. He believed himself a scapegoat, or at the very least, that another would shield him from the gravest consequences. I stared into the fire. "You suspect Lady Farnsworth still?" "I suspect truth still," he replied, rising abruptly. "Fetch your coat, my dear fellow. We shall pay one last visit to Grosvenor Square before the day is done." The carriage rolled through streets, muffled by snow, the gas lamps glowing like pale stars. When we arrived, the household was subdued but not mourning. Lady Farnsworth received us in the drawing-room, her expression composed yet wary. The great tree in the corner glittered with glass baubles, but beneath its gaiety lingered a tension so sharp it might have been cut with a knife. Holmes inclined his head courteously. "I come not as accuser, madam, but as inquirer. There are certain points of the case which remain unfinished." She tried to smile. "Surely all is finished, Mr. Holmes. The diamonds are recovered, my husband's honor preserved." Holmes's gaze drifted to the piano, where sheet music lay open. "You play, I see, Beethoven and Chopin. That mazurka, however, has a curious smudge of wax along its edge." He crossed to it and held the paper to the light. "Vermilion again, the same as the residue in your husband's study." Her composure trembled. "You cannot mean—" "On the contrary, I mean exactly this. The safe was opened by the correct key, not a duplicate. You removed it from your husband's watch chain as he slept, then returned it before dawn. The copy made in the basement was a red herring, a decoy, no doubt arranged by Captain Allardyce to divert suspicion should things go awry." She sank into a chair, pale as ivory. "I swear I thought he would return them. He promised. He said it was only for a few days. He had influence over me. Emotional influence." "Yes," Holmes said gently, "but the greater mystery lies not in his hold upon you, but in the hand that guided him. The telegram I dispatched before leaving Baker Street confirmed my suspicion. Allardyce's gaming debts were indeed real, yet they were not owed to foreign tables. They were purchased in London by an intermediary, a financier operating under the name Edwin Carslake. Does that name signify anything to you?" She stared blankly for a moment, then gave a strangled cry. "My husband's partner, his advisor. He arranged all our investments." "Exactly," Holmes said, eyes glinting. Karslake needed funds to conceal his embezzlement from the Farnsworth firm. He exploited Allardyce's weakness and your desperation. The theft was engineered to ruin your husband's reputation, leaving Karslake free to abscond with the company's capital while suspicion fixed upon you both. A gasp escaped her. Then the diamonds were never meant to be sold, only lost? Precisely. Their recovery, therefore, will expose the entire fraud. I have already informed Lestrade to detain Karslake at Charing Cross. The man was purchasing a ticket to Brussels under the name Evans. It was not Allardyce, but Karslake who composed the true scheme. Her tears fell silently. Holmes, uncharacteristically gentle, took the pouch from the mantel and placed it in her trembling hands. There, madam. Return these to your husband. Tell him that Christmas has restored both his fortune and his faith. As we departed, the snow muffled our steps. Holmes walked in thoughtful silence until we reached the corner of the square. Then he spoke, low and reflective. A curious world, Watson. Men steal for greed, women for love, and yet it is always vanity that sets the match to the powder. And justice? I asked quietly. He smiled faintly. Justice, my dear Watson, is the melody that plays only after the noise has ceased. The next morning dawned bright and cold, the snow crisp upon the eaves of Baker Street. The city had awakened to its customary bustle, carriages rumbling, vendors crying their wares, but within our sitting room a rare stillness prevailed. Holmes sat at the table, his long fingers methodically arranging correspondence beside the untouched breakfast tray. The morning light caught the blue veins at his temple, making him appear at once austere and curiously fragile. I had grown accustomed to seeing him thus, after a case poised between triumph and exhaustion, mind still sifting the ashes of mystery for any remaining ember. I unfolded the Times and could not help but read aloud. The remarkable recovery of the Farnsworth diamonds by Mr. Sherlock Holmes has caused a stir in financial circles. Mr. Edwin Karslake, a partner in the Farnsworth Steel Company, has been arrested on charges of fraud and conspiracy. Captain Allardyce, whose involvement appears secondary, is said to be cooperating with the authorities. The jewels, valued at £30,000, were returned intact. I looked up. Your name appears in every column, my dear Holmes. He waved the paper away with a faint smile. Public applause is the poor man's opiate, Watson. I prefer the quiet intoxication of logic. But surely you take satisfaction in the result, I pressed. You have freed an innocent woman and restored a household from ruin. Holmes leaned back, eyes half closed. Satisfaction? Yes, of a kind. But note, my friend, how fragile innocence can be when tangled in affection. Lady Farnsworth's guilt was moral, not legal. Her weakness lay in misplaced faith. There is a peculiar cruelty in sentiment. It clouds judgment and invites manipulation. In that sense, she was both victim and accomplice. I frowned. You speak as though emotion were a defect. Not a defect, he replied softly. Merely a deviation from reason. Yet perhaps the world would be intolerably dull without it. He rose, crossed to the window, and gazed out at the pale sunlight diffused through the fog. Do you observe, Watson, how swiftly the snow erases all trace of turmoil? By tomorrow the tracks of our hansom will be gone, the house in Grosvenor Square peaceful once more, and no one the wiser that greed, folly and devotion nearly destroyed 3 lives. At that moment, Mrs. Hudson entered with a small parcel. A messenger left this for you, Mr. Holmes, no address given. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside lay a velvet case containing a single diamond, one of the smaller stones from the Farnsworth collection, and a folded note in a delicate hand. Holmes read it silently before passing it to me. To Mr. Sherlock Holmes, a token of gratitude for your mercy and understanding. Enclosed stone once symbolized vanity. May it now serve as a reminder that truth, when found, must be honored with humility. Yours sincerely, Clara Farnsworth. Holmes studied the gem a long while, then replaced it in the case. She has learned more from this affair than most learn in a lifetime. Let it never be said, Watson, that sentiment cannot redeem itself when enlightened by truth. He set the case upon the mantel beside his violin, a trifle for the collection. There followed a comfortable silence. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. The fire murmured. And outside, the faint chime of distant bells drifted through the air, a reminder that it was Christmas Day. Holmes at last took up his violin, tuning it with deft precision. The first notes of a carol, tender and haunting, filled the room. It was not his usual sharp, analytical playing, but something softer, almost wistful. I sat back, letting the melody weave through my thoughts, the memory of Lady Farnsworth's trembling confession, of Allardyce's ruined pride, of the snow glistening on the iron railings of Grosvenor Square. Beneath it all, I sensed the curious warmth that sometimes stirred in Holmes, despite his protests against sentiment. When the last note faded, he laid down the bow and smiled faintly. "You see, Watson, every case leaves an echo. One must play it out until silence restores order. Therein lies both music and deduction." I nodded, struck by the rare serenity in his tone. "And yet," I said, "you've given them peace as well as justice." He looked into the fire, eyes reflecting its quiet blaze. "Peace, perhaps. Justice, yes. But understanding that is the rarest gift of all. It is what turns a crime into a lesson and a failure into wisdom. Now, my dear fellow, pour us each a cup of coffee. There is no finer celebration than the end of confusion." Outside, the bells of Street Mary's rang once more, clear against the winter air. Holmes reclined in his chair, the faintest smile curving his lips. Another Christmas, Watson. Another riddle resolved. And tomorrow, who knows, the world will conspire again to amuse us. And so, as the snow fell softly upon Baker Street, I watched the world's keenest mind rest for a fleeting moment, content, if only until the next enigma knocked upon our door. It was 3 days later when the final chord of the affair was struck, an unexpected note that proved, as ever, that no case truly ends when the culprit is caught. The morning was brisk, the frost glittering like powdered glass upon the window panes of Baker Street. I had returned from my rounds to find Holmes deep in correspondence. The table cluttered with letters, newspapers, and one curious scrap of parchment that he held delicately between tweezers. His expression was one of intense concentration, the grey eyes bright with that strange inner fire that spoke of discovery. "You arrive at the proper moment, Watson," he said without looking up. "The Farnsworth case has sprouted a final root, one that might have escaped the eye of a less persistent gardener." I set down my hat. "Surely you don't mean, after all that, the matter isn't settled?" "Settled, yes, but not concluded," he replied. "Justice is satisfied, but curiosity seldom is." He handed me the scrap. "What do you make of that?" It appeared to be the corner of a letter, torn hastily, the handwriting firm and elegant. The fragment read, "Ensure the transfer is completed before the year's end. Karslake will delay the ledger examination long enough." The ink was brown, the paper thick, and embossed with a small monogram, a stylized R, entwined with a crown. "It's Karslake's hand," I said, recalling the man's correspondence in the Times. "But whose crest is that?" Holmes gave a thin smile. "That, my dear fellow, belongs to Lord Rotherby, chairman of the Royal Foundry, and one of Farnsworth's principal investors. Karslake was not merely covering his own thefts, he was acting as intermediary in a scheme of industrial espionage. The diamonds were the distraction, not the prize." I stared. "Then the motive for the heist was to divert Farnsworth's attention," Holmes finished crisply. While he despaired over his wife's supposed betrayal and Allardyce's disgrace, Karslake's associates planned to sell Farnsworth's steel patents abroad. You see now why the theft was executed with such theatrical precision. It was never about jewels, it was about time. He rose abruptly, reaching for his coat. "Come, Watson, Rotherby's carriage was seen near the docks last night, and I have little doubt he intends to flee to Calais before his name appears in tomorrow's financial reports. Within the hour we were at the wharf, where the tide lapped sullenly against the pilings and a raw wind carried the scent of coal smoke and salt. The great steamer Étoile du Nord loomed at anchor, passengers already boarding. Among them moved a tall figure in a fur-lined coat, glancing nervously over his shoulder. Holmes's hand tightened on my arm. "Rotherby," he whispered. "Observe the portmanteau too heavy for personal effects. Shall we, Watson?" We intercepted him at the gangway. "You travel early, my lord," Holmes remarked pleasantly. Rotherby froze, color draining from his face. "Mr. Holmes, this is an outrage. I am merely escaping the inevitable." Holmes interposed. "I regret the inconvenience, but Scotland Yard would prefer you remain in the kingdom until certain financial irregularities are clarified. That portmanteau, if you please." 2 constables emerged from the mist at Holmes's signal. Rotherby hesitated, then surrendered the case. When opened, it revealed not only Farnsworth's stolen documents, but ledgers detailing a network of illicit exchanges, names, sums, and shipping routes. It was, as Holmes later told Lestrade, a confession written in ink and arithmetic. By the time we returned to Baker Street that evening, the lamps were alight and the streets hummed with rumors of scandal. Holmes said little during the drive. Only when we were seated once more before the fire did he speak, his voice low and reflective. "The curious thing, Watson, is how human motives intertwine like the gears of a watch. Karslake's greed turned the first cog, Allardyce's desperation moved the second, Lady Farnsworth's affection wound the spring. Yet, behind them all, the great wheel was Rotherby's ambition. Remove one, and the machine fails. Together, they mark the passage of ruin." I nodded. "And Farnsworth himself? He will survive," Holmes said. "Adversity is the crucible of character. Perhaps he will even forgive." He smiled faintly, though I doubt he will ever again trust a safe, a friend, or a Christmas party. We both laughed quietly at that. Outside, the snow began to fall again, silent and unending, cloaking London in its soft anonymity. Holmes drew his violin toward him and plucked a single note, pure and lingering. "There, Watson," he said at last. "Our Christmas heist has resolved itself into a symphony of folly and redemption. Let us close the score." He played a slow air, melancholy, tender, and final. And as the music faded into the hush of the night, I reflected, not for the first time, that beneath the logic and steel of his mind, Sherlock Holmes possessed something rarer still, the capacity to find beauty, even in the aftermath of crime. The new year had barely dawned when I received an early summons to Baker Street. The messenger, breathless and red-eared from the chill, handed me a note written in Holmes's bold, slanting hand. "Come at once, Watson. The final turn of the Christmas affair reveals itself. Urgent, though not perilous." Within half an hour, I was climbing the familiar 17 steps, my mind alight with curiosity. Holmes greeted me at the door himself, an unusual gesture for him, and I noticed immediately that the languor of recent days had vanished. His eyes were sharp, his manner brisk, and upon the table lay a scattering of telegrams, foreign envelopes, and one heavy packet sealed with crimson wax. The morning fog pressed against the windows, but within the room glowed the promise of revelation. "Ah, Watson," he said, rubbing his hands together. "You arrive just in time for the epilogue. Sit down, and I shall spare you the newspaper's confusion by supplying the truth directly from the source." I obliged, taking my chair by the fire as he broke the seal on the packet. From within he drew several pages of closely written script. "This," he explained, "is a letter from Mr. Reginald Farnsworth. It appears our friend has been busy during his period of reflection." He read aloud, "My dear Mr. Holmes, I owe you more than gratitude. I owe you my peace of mind. Karslake has confessed fully his intention was not only to defraud me, but to destroy the reputation of my firm, that he might sell my patents to continental interests. Lord Rotherby's complicity has also been established. I have been offered restitution by the Crown on the condition that I testify at the inquest. My wife has retired to her family estate in Sussex for her health. She begs that her name be kept from the proceedings. In all this calamity, it is only your intervention that preserved what honor remained to us. Pray, accept this enclosed check as a token of my esteem." Holmes paused, turning the check over with faint amusement. 1,000 guineas, he murmured. The man measures gratitude as he measures steel by weight and purity. "I shall return it, of course." "You refuse it?" I exclaimed. "Surely, Holmes. No one would think the less of you for accepting what you have so richly earned." He smiled faintly, lighting his pipe. "My dear Watson, to take payment from gratitude is to tarnish it. Besides, I have already profited intellectually." He leaned back, the smoke curling like thought made visible. "Do you recall, Watson, what I said when this began, that there was mischief under that roof? I had not then the faintest notion how deeply it ran. A simple theft transformed into conspiracy, a domestic quarrel into an affair of empire. It is an elegant reminder that every human tragedy begins in the heart and ends in arithmetic." I laughed softly. "You make crime sound almost poetic." "Crime is poetic in its way," he replied. "It is the dark rhyme to civilization's verse, the counterpoint to order, which gives my profession its music." For a few minutes, we sat in companionable silence while he read the remaining pages. Then, with a sudden gesture, he tossed them into the fire. "Enough of Farnsworth and his diamonds. Let the ashes keep their secrets. I suspect another puzzle will find us soon enough." No sooner had he spoken than a knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson entered, carrying a telegram upon a tray. Holmes tore it open, his expression sharpening as he read. "Ha! From Lestrade. It seems a certain jeweler in Hatton Garden has been found strangled in his office. The safe untouched, the window latched from within, and remarkably a crimson feather lying on the desk." I groaned. "Surely not another locked room mystery, Holmes. You have barely rested from the last." He laughed quietly, reaching for his coat. "My dear Watson, rest is the privilege of dull minds. For us, curiosity is the only true holiday. Come, we shall see whether this feather belongs to a bird or to a man." And so, before the clock struck 9, we were once again rattling through the fog-choked streets of London, drawn irresistibly toward a fresh enigma. The cab wheels splashed through the slush. The bells of Street Mary's tolled faintly behind us. I watched Holmes from my corner, his profile, keen and resolute, the faint glint of adventure already alive in his eyes. The Christmas heist, as the papers would call it, had ended. Yet its echo carried us onward, into another labyrinth of deceit and deduction, for such was the rhythm of our lives together. Mystery, revelation, and the quiet interval before the next storm. Snow continued to fall that week in a gentle hush, as if the heavens themselves sought to blanket London's recent sins beneath a white shroud. The air on Baker Street had grown clearer, but within our rooms the atmosphere retained the curious energy that always lingered in the aftermath of a particularly intricate case. Holmes, in his usual fashion, had returned to his chemical experiments with manic energy, but I knew from the way he kept glancing at the mantelpiece, that single diamond still resting beside his violin, that his mind had not quite closed the door on the case of the Christmas heist. Late that evening, as I penned the final lines of my personal account of the affair, a quiet knock disturbed the stillness. Mrs. Hudson entered, holding a plain envelope without markings. "Left at the door, sir." No messenger, no signature. Holmes took it with a flicker of interest, slit the flap with his penknife, and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. He read it twice, once quickly. once with unnerving slowness, then handed it to me. You may have solved the theft, Mr. Holmes, but not the reason. The game played at Grosvenor Square was older than you suspect. Older than steel. Older than diamonds. One day, when the snow melts, the truth will come into bloom. Until then, Merry Christmas. There was no name, no crest, just those chilling lines in a neat, feminine hand. Holmes was very still. It seems, he said finally, that we have not been playing a game of solitaire after all. I stared at the letter. A threat? No, he murmured. A warning or a promise. He crossed to the window, drawing back the curtain. Do you know the most dangerous villain, Watson? It is not the one who acts out of greed or wrath. It is the one who plays with time. The architect who sets traps not for days, but for years. Whoever wrote this has been planning something far longer than we imagined. But the case is closed. Karslake is under arrest. Rotherby will be indicted. What more could there be? Holmes tapped the letter. This is the voice of someone who watched, who waited, who allowed events to unfold precisely as needed, not to steal, but to observe who could be made to steal. A chill ran through me, not from the winter air, but from the implication. You mean the entire affair was engineered as a kind of experiment? Precisely, Holmes said. Each person was a variable. Allardyce's desperation, Lady Farnsworth's guilt, Karslake's cunning, Rotherby's greed. The one who sent this letter did not act, they provoked. And that, he added softly, is a far more dangerous intelligence than we've yet faced. The fire crackled as I reread the note. The truth will come into bloom. Holmes turned back to the mantel, picked up the diamond, and studied it under the gaslight. They left this here for a reason too, Watson. Not merely as gratitude, as bait. I suspect it's not one of the Farnsworth stones at all. He crossed to his cabinet, withdrew a jeweler's lens, and examined the gem with exquisite precision. Yes, just as I feared. Not a Farnsworth cut. Look here, see the flaw near the girdle? A deliberate imperfection. This stone was meant to be noticed, tracked, perhaps even followed. A marker, a message. Whoever our shadowed observer is, they've left their fingerprint in crystal. I swallowed hard. So it isn't over. Holmes set the gem down with care. It has barely begun. That night, he did not play the violin, nor did he read, or smoke, or retreat into one of his restless silences. He simply sat in his chair, fingers steepled before him, as the snow fell quietly beyond the glass. I knew then that this case, more than any other, had unsettled something deep within him. And in truth, it had unsettled me as well. For all our triumphs, all the logical threads Holmes had woven into a net of certainty, we had missed something, someone. Outside, the fog shifted against the gas lamps like a living thing, and the bells of Street Mary's rang midnight once more. The game, it seemed, was still afoot. The final days of that winter passed uneventfully, or so it would appear to the casual eye. London resumed its rhythm, the scandal surrounding the Farnsworth affair slowly fading beneath newer headlines and fresher intrigues. But in the rooms of 221B Baker Street, a subtle tension lingered like the scent of a candle long extinguished. Holmes remained preoccupied, not with immediate inquiries or cases, but with patterns, letters, and something invisible that had taken root in his mind. He had cleared the center table entirely of his usual clutter and replaced it with a map of London, pinned with delicate brass tacks. Thread connected certain locations: Grosvenor Square, Hatton Garden, Pall Mall, and most ominously, a cluster near the docks. Beside the map sat the crimson-feathered telegram from Lestrade, the unsigned letter we had received days ago, and the diamond still in its velvet case, unopened since Holmes had identified its origin. One evening, as I returned from an engagement at the Royal College of Surgeons, I found Holmes seated in his armchair, the letter open on his knee, and the diamond glinting faintly in the firelight. He did not look up at my entry. "I have made inquiries," he said. as if continuing a conversation we hadn't begun. The handwriting on the note is disguised, of course, but the formation of the loops, the upward strokes on the T's, the backward flick of the R's, suggest a convent education. Continental, possibly Swiss. As for the paper, handmade, watermark obscure, but the pulp content suggests manufacture near Lake Geneva. Do you believe the sender is foreign then? I asked, setting aside my coat. Not foreign, he said. Educated abroad, perhaps, but the references, the idiom, the veiled language of performance and blooming are distinctly English. The mind behind this letter understands theatre, possibly politics. Certainly control. I felt a chill. You mean to say the true author of this plot of the entire affair is still at large? Holmes nodded slowly. The Farnsworth theft was merely a window, one pane in a much larger design. Carslake, Allardyce, even Rotherby were pawns, some self-aware, others not. And pawns, Watson, are always sacrificed to shield the king. We sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling softly. Outside, sleet tapped gently against the windows. The city beyond was cloaked in its usual mystery, but now it felt closer, watching, even. At last I spoke. What will you do? Holmes's eyes never left the fire. Wait. Watch. Listen. The mind behind this cannot resist continuing the game. Someone who manipulates others with such precision, who times crimes to the rhythm of sentiment and scandal, will not stop after one performance. They require an audience. And I intend to be in the front row. I shifted uneasily. But if they remain hidden, if they vanish again into the shadows? He gave a rare smile. Then we smoke them out, slowly, carefully. They made a mistake, you see. He held up the diamond. This is not bait. It is a signature. I leaned forward. What do you mean? Holmes rose, fetched a small bottle of reagent from his desk, and dropped a solution onto the stone. Under the gaslight, the gem flared a brief, brilliant green before settling into dull clarity once more. A very rare fluorite treatment, Holmes explained. Invisible under most conditions, but when exposed to this chemical voila. A unique identifier used by precisely 3 cutters in all of Europe, one of whom disappeared from his Paris workshop 6 months ago, just before a fire destroyed the building, presumed dead. But I now believe he lives and works for our unseen puppeteer. The implications struck us both in silence. We were not merely dealing with a criminal or even a ring of criminals. We had brushed against a hidden network, one capable of reshaping the fates of men through the subtlest touch. At last, Holmes placed the gem back into its case and shut it firmly. Let them believe the game has ended. Let them think I've put away the pieces. But when they make their next move, and they will, I shall be ready. He turned to me, that familiar light of battle kindling in his eyes. Watson, make no mistake. The true case, the one hidden beneath all the glitter and ash, has only just begun. And as the fire dimmed and the night deepened over Baker Street, I sensed, as I always did at such moments, that we stood not at the end of a mystery, but at the threshold of something far greater. 2 weeks later, on a damp January afternoon, Holmes and I were returning from a routine consultation near Lincoln's Inn when something unexpected occurred. Unexpected, not because of its drama, but because of its quiet precision, a quality Holmes had come to associate not with ordinary crimes, but with the hand behind the letter. We were cutting through a narrow passage behind Chancery Lane, an alley more accustomed to errand boys and cats than gentlemen, when Holmes paused. His gaze had fixed on something ahead. A folded slip of white paper, pristine and deliberate, pinned beneath a polished brass button. It had been placed there not by accident, but with design. He picked it up and turned it over slowly. I saw the color drain slightly from his face, not in fear, but in confirmation. The handwriting on the outside was the same tidy, anonymous script as the previous note. He opened it with care, and we both read, "The piece has moved. Black Queen to D4. Your move, Mr. Holmes." There was no signature, no explanation. But attached to the note with a clip was a single calling card. No name, no address, only a tiny etching of a red rook carved into the center. Holmes stared at it for a long moment. Then, with a breath that was almost a sigh, he slipped the card into his pocket. "We're being invited, Watson." "To what?" I asked, though I already sensed the answer. "A game," he murmured. "And this time, not one of detection alone. A game of deeper strategy. Someone is testing the limits of observation, timing, manipulation, not to escape justice, but to study how justice responds." I could feel the old tension rise in me. "Do you believe this is the same person who orchestrated the Farnsworth affair?" "I do. The precision is the same. The psychology, identical. This is no criminal empire, not in the traditional sense. This is intellectual warfare. Each crime is a move on a board we've barely glimpsed." We returned to Baker Street at once. Holmes spread his map again, adding a new tack and thread connecting the alleyway behind Chancery Lane. The red rook card now sat pinned beside the previous diamond, forming a pair of quiet challenges. He worked through the night. When I awoke near dawn, I found him still at the table, reviewing newspapers from multiple cities, checking shipping manifests, tracing property sales and business mergers with his usual ruthless clarity. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "Patterns, alliances, transactions that seem legal but feel choreographed, anything that resembles a ghost's fingerprint." He lit a fresh match and pointed to a ledger. "Did you know, Watson, that one of Rotherby's shell companies attempted to acquire land next to the Admiralty's new naval dry dock? Or that a fund once managed by Karslake was quietly reopened last spring under a new alias in Berlin? None of it proves anything, but it suggests a pattern of preparation, like a player arranging the board long before the opening move." "And you think they want you involved?" "They require me," he said, eyes narrowing. "Why leave a message? Why deliver another token? This is not a threat, it's an invitation. They want to see how I'll respond. Not to stop me, but to learn from me." I sat back, shaken by the idea. "Then you are not merely their opponent. You are part of their experiment." Holmes gave a tight smile. "Or their equal, perhaps their mirror." That day, he wrote a reply, short, cryptic, and in a cipher known only to those with a grounding in ancient Greek mathematics. He enclosed it in an envelope without address or name, save one symbol, a red rook drawn in ink. He handed it to a boy from the irregulars with instructions to leave it in the same alley where we had found the note. When I asked him what he had written, he replied simply, "Pawn to E5. And that, it seemed, was that. The Farnsworth case, for all its diamonds and deceit, was now merely the first movement in a far greater symphony. The shadows had thickened. A new player had entered the stage, one who did not seek profit, nor even power, but understanding. Someone who viewed Holmes not as a threat, but as the final variable in a grand experiment. Holmes folded his hands behind his back and looked out the window as the morning fog rose above London's rooftops. "The board is set, Watson," he said quietly. "And now we shall see who has the better mind."